Good morning. It's actually really difficult to speak to so many brilliant people. It's firstly an honor to be here, and an honor to be here amongst all of you. I suppose where I'd like to start is by saying I only share one perspective, right? In a room as brilliant as this and as plural as this and having so many different worldviews, I want to contribute one perspective. And the perspective I want to bring forth is that the scale of change we're facing is no longer about new products and new services. It's about a fundamental change in how we see and manifest in the world. It's a transformation of how we imagine ourselves and how we imagine our relationship to the world. All of the products, many of the languages, dominant languages like English, have constructed a worldview. They've been part over the last 400 years of constructing a worldview, an object-oriented worldview, where we see the world through objects. The English language is predominantly noun-based. That noun-based worldview, that object-based worldview, that object-subject-based worldview has, over the last 400 years, created the landscape we see around us, but also permitted the violence we see around us. The separation of object and subject, classification theory, how we see the world, has permitted a theory of violence. That violence we see manifested around us, not only in the great historic and present tyrannies that we see, but also in everyday violence of how we relate to each other. And why I bring that up is that the scale of change that I think we're seeing is a different worldview, where we have to recognize our systemic entanglement. Our entanglement with each other, our entanglement with the planet, and our entanglement with the future. If we're really honest, the current world that we're living in is almost certainly terminating future generations. Every decision we make is killing future generations. And if we're going to transform this is going to be a transformation deep at the level of who we are and how we imagine ourselves. But it's not easy. Let's put some numbers to this. We know that our civilization, let's call ourselves one shared civilization, which we largely are, 8 billion human beings, sits on 500 billion human units worth of energy a year. So our civilization is a 508 billion energy civilization. Between 2019 and 2020, the energy demand of our civilization went up faster than all the installed renewables since 1970. All the installed renewables since 1970. We have to replace 500 billion human unit worths of energy and replace it from hydrocarbons to a different flow. Our material usage. We know, for example, the average Swede, my Swedish friends, consumes about 27 tons of matter a year. The global average is 2 tons. So we're talking about an energy transition, a material transition. We know we can't afford this. Yet at the same time, what we're facing is global shortages of copper. So if we're going to make a transition, we're going to have to make a transition by actually finding new ways of mining copper to be able to actually sustain or be anywhere close to the transition to a renewable energy source. At the same time, between 1.5, as we hit any of the climate change issues, of between 1.7 and 1.9 degrees, at least one of our 5 major food baskets will become unreliable. You've just seen what's happened in Ukraine and its impacts. That's just a beginning. We know by 2050, we're talking about 1.5 up to 1.2 billion people being made on the move as a result of climate change. Syria was, I think, 7 million people, and the European Union and the Europe fell apart as an ideological place to be able to deal with it. Ukraine is 14 million people, and you're seeing the issues already emerge around. 1.2 billion people. Why I'm giving you these numbers is because I think at the heart of these numbers and the back of these numbers is actually a deeper question. And the deeper question for me is this. I don't think if India, UK, Europe, US make a climate transition, let's say we all do it, we will all still fail. We will all still fail. Because the class of problems that we're facing require actually planetary transformation. If 2/3 of the planet does this, we're all still literally dead. 2/3 of the planet does this, we're all still literally dead. This requires a fundamental transformation in how we engage at a planetary scale. I'm not saying the world, I'm not saying the world global, because I think those are abstractions. The planetary relationship is a human, machine, ecological, institutional relationship in a rich format. And it requires us to transform at the deep level of how do we make change at the planetary scale. Now, I say this stuff and I say these numbers not as a mechanism. Some people say, oh my God, these are scary numbers. Let's talk about stuff we can deal with. Let's make some ethical chocolate. It just doesn't cut it. My invitation here is that actually it's an invitation to all of us to be bigger. It's not to be afraid, but to be bigger. And the scary part of this, there is no choice. We think there's a choice, but there is actually no choice. Because if we do not make this transition, we are almost certainly in a mutually assured pathway to destruction. Mutually assured pathway to destruction. And it won't be climate change that will kill us. Let me break this out for you. It will almost certainly be actually war and weapons of mass destruction unleashed as vast inequality and terror falls out over the world. So the scale of what we're facing requires a new type of response. A response at the planetary scale, but also not at a global scale, not as a kind of united sense. It requires a mutual development pathway that respects vast plurality and vast diversity in making these transitions. And it also requires a fundamental transformation in our relationship of how we perceive ourselves. Are we individuals? Are we discrete objects? Is nature a resource? Is the future there to be pillaged and colonized? How do we deal with the historic traumas of actually vast injustices around the world? How do we build a shared platform to move forward? And those are real material issues that we're going to have to resolve together. And further, as we look forth into this, what becomes clear is this transition goes into our deep codes. Things like property rights. Things like who owns the right to destroy soil? Who owns a butterfly? Who owns the right to destroy a 200, 300-year tree? Who owns these rights when actually the tree is not about the land, it's about vast services passed all around the world in some format around? How do we build a new relationship is going to be fundamental. Because climate change is just a symptom of the challenge that we're facing. It is not the challenge. Biodiversity losses, plastics in your bloodstream, or mental health, all these things are externalities of a world that's deeply problematized. I also think this stuff is in history possible. We've certainly done this in nation-state terms. We've certainly done this at the birth of Europe. There was some extraordinary activity done at the scale of a continent. Now we're going to have to do this across continents in a new way. And not only is it necessary, And not only do I think it's possible, but it does require a fundamental transition. Now, as we look forth, that fundamental transition is at the sense of our culture. If I look forth into the next 40 years, it's almost certainly likely in the next 40 years, if we as a planetary civilization are able to make the next 40 years, we can get access to near infinite energy and near infinite materials. Right? That's where the technological base is taking us. But actually our pathway to get there requires us to transform from being competitive organisms to being a collaborative organism at the scale of the planet. If we can build the collaborative capacity for development, we can actually unleash a whole bunch of capacity that's unimaginable for us as a civilization. But it requires us to do significant work at the root level of transformation. At the root level of our language, of how we understand each other, of how we understand the world and how we relate to each other. And when we talk about systems, as many of us do, what we're really talking about is how do you organize in democracies or distributed agency? How do we organize and break the paradigm of management? Management is a theory of control, a worldview that's born from the role of kings and queens and armies. How do you build the new paradigm of actually learning modality as a mechanism of organizing? This requires a fundamental transition. We're all used to the theory of management. Your employment contracts are actually tyrannies of control. How do you transform the basics of the world around you? How do we go from chief CEOs to chief learning officers that create the paradigm to unleash the capacity of every human with care? In a complex world, care is not a nice to have, it's a fundamental. Because I don't know the damage that I do in my relationship to you if I do not operate with a duty of care. I cannot operate through a theory of transactional optimization, optimizing my world versus your world, because I don't know the damage that I do. So when we use the words of care, and Professor Victoria Held and many, many brilliant people have been talking about this, these aren't just nice words. They are fundamental recodings of our relationship to the world. Look around you. Look at everything that you have. Your title, your employment contracts, how you pay. These things need to be recoded for a new world. How we own or don't own. What does it mean to operate in that world? So this is a revolution of the big, but it's a revolution of our everyday. And it requires us to deal with actually the traumas that we've been born up with. We were talking last night over dinner, and the reality is there's no longer time to wait to say this is for the next generation. You know, we're waiting for the kids to come forth. The reality is it is this generation. All of you. There is no time for the kids. And the reality is we are almost certainly the interstitial generation, the generation between worlds. A generation that is possessed by languages of the old world, ways of seeing, but has sight of the new world, has sight of what this new world could look like. And it is our duty to recode things. And everything is recodable. The limited company was an idea that allowed for a form of wealth accumulation and power. Everything around you, property, it's no longer appropriate to talk about humans as property, but we do talk about land as property. I think this is a revolution at that level. And it will change everything around us. And we have no choice but to embrace this. There is no other pathway other than making this at a planetary scale. Together, addressing our historic injustices and moving forward. Together. That requires an extraordinary transformation I think, from us, but all of us together. And that's why I'm really honored to be here in front of so many of you who are doing incredible work. And I apologize for taking up your time, because I think your time is the most precious thing. And with that, I'll thank you, and thank you.